85. Channel 85. Channel 85. Channel 85. Channel 85. Channel 85.
Good evening, folks. I'm Scott Swafford. I'm the editor at the Columbia Missourian. We're here tonight for Ask Darwin Hyman. This will be the mayor's last installment of this show because we've got an election coming up and your 15-year tenure as mayor is about to end in 10, 11 days, something like that.
That's right. It's just about over, and we'll know who the new mayor is even before my tenure actually ends. But so for all practical purposes, with next Tuesday being the election, it's about over. We have one council meeting before the election on the eve of the election.
Right.
And then that'll be my last council meeting. 300 and some council meetings, 350,
Wow.
something like that.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and so it's going to seem different after that, I think.
I would expect so, and I'd like to talk a little bit later about some of your plans for once your tenure as mayor is over. And I'd really like to use this show to maybe get away from immediate city council business
Sure.
and that sort of thing, and allow you to reflect a little bit about your 15 years as mayor. But a couple of business items off the bat. You know, we have the election Tuesday, and I know the city has placed 5 charter amendments on the ballot.
That's right.
And it's been rare in my experience that there have been any amendments to the city charter. In fact, I can't remember any in my time here in Columbia. So I wonder if you might take a few minutes to explain what those are, maybe make a pitch for them if you'd like to do that.
All right, well, I'm for all of them.
Okay.
And let me see if I can remember what they
Sure,
all
they're
are.
propositions 2 through 6.
All right, that helps. But one of them is to say that when it comes to the water and light director, the present charter says he must be a certified professional engineer. And we've found that when it comes to the market for people to head up a utility, like the Columbia Water and Light Utility, which is essentially a reasonable sized utility business. Now, we're not out to make a profit to pay shareholders, but we are out to provide electricity at the lowest cost and to reinvest into the utility. It's owned by every citizen in Columbia, but it's operated on a business-like basis. And engineers are technical people who know how to do technical things, but they aren't necessarily trained to be managers of businesses. And so we found that when it comes to the market, that it has limited the kind of person that we're able to recruit. And that there is a relatively limited number of people who are actually professional engineers who have the desire and ability to manage a company.
And they command very high salaries.
Then they can command very high salaries, partly because engineering commands a high salary. So we would like to have the flexibility to go out and hire people who have management experience. And there are plenty of people who manage utilities in a very good way, very satisfactory way, without having that professional engineering degree, so or certificate. So that's the idea behind it. And why that particular requirement was in the charter, I don't know. I argue that charters really shouldn't get down to that kind of detail, actually. So I think it's probably something that should be corrected anyway.
Okay. I just want to remind the viewers that if you have any questions for the mayor, feel free to call in.
Now, let's give them the number.
Yeah, what is the number?
There you go.
Okay.
876-7236. And
Great.
we'd like to hear from people, really would.
Absolutely, absolutely. You guys probably have better questions than I do. But there are 4 other propositions. I believe one of them would extend the amount of time that the city clerk has to validate petitions for council or initiative petitions.
That's right.
Anything to say about that one?
Yes, again, this is something that has become out of date. It used to be that when people filed petitions, first of all, the number of signatures would be much fewer because it's based on the number of people who voted in the last mayoral election. And as the city has grown from maybe 35,000 when the charter was originated up to 100,000, obviously that number is going to be a lot bigger. So it puts a much heavier burden on the city clerk. Not only that, the city clerk no longer is the person who makes those examinations to find out if the petitions are valid. It's done in the county clerk's office because that's where the voting records are. And so the city clerk then has to take those and take them over to the county clerk's office. Well, the county clerk has plenty to do without these unexpected events coming along. And then we might have a period of time when they pile up on each other. There may be 2 or 3 petitions. And so it just is basically unworkable right now. It puts a burden on everybody that we can't handle. It's just the result of change of time. So we're simply trying to get more time in order to make this work. And so that's the idea. And so that's I think, a good housekeeping amendment. And I hope people will take pity on the city clerk and pass it. And by the way, we have an excellent city clerk. It's not
Sheila Amin, right?
Sheila Amin is her name, and she's just excellent and extremely diligent. And when something like this comes along, she'll work over the weekend, work at night, and still have a hard time getting it done. And so.
Okay. Proposition 2, you know, I'm a journalist, so I don't want to express an opinion, but it seems like common sense. It would allow the city manager to appoint an assistant city manager to act in his stead when he or she is away.
Yes, it now calls for a department head.
Right.
And at the time that the charter was passed about 50 years ago, there were no assistant city managers.
Right.
But the city's grown in complexity and size. We've talked about that. And so the assistant city manager does the kind of work that a city manager does. Department heads manage their individual departments without a view of the overall city necessarily. And so it seems to make good sense and a good administration to say, all right, if the city manager is unable to serve at any particular time, that a assistant city manager could be, not necessarily has to be, but could be appointed.
And then there are a couple that might make people's heads spin when they read the ballot language that have to do with financing. One would allow the council to make some interdepartmental transfers of funds within the first half of the budget year. The other one has to do with how we ensure city deposits, and it would make it match state law.
Right.
Anything
This
to say
is,
about this?
I hope none of the listeners or viewers go to sleep as we talk about this.
Sure, we'll get on to more exciting stuff soon.
But in reality, there's a vote on it, so
Right.
we need to talk about it.
Sure.
When the charter was put together, I guess it may have been lack of trust or something, but the idea was that when you pass a budget, and the public can see what that budget is, then you need to operate within that budget exactly as you have it for each of the different categories of spending for the first 6 months. You can't pass a budget and then go change something. Well, in modern times, we have found that that is sometimes pretty costly because we will pass a budget that calls for spending money on some kind of thing toward the end of the year. But if we could use that money at the beginning of the year for another purpose, then we could save going out and borrowing money. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
And so we realize that with the complexity of city government today, and with the scrutiny that we get from the Missourian and the other media, and with the way we present the budget and put the budget onto the web, everything is out there in the open. Any transfer has to be approved by the city council. And so in order to save money and be able to manage the finances in a modern way, we need to make that change.
Sure. And then the last one about securing city deposits. Anything to say about that one? Again, we don't want to bore the, the viewers. But.
Yeah, there's sort of an amazing situation. Again, the charter again, I think it reflects the change in times, but it said that when you have city deposits, they must be protected by security in government-backed bonds. Well, the law, that's the way the law was sort of universally for government monies. But now, they now allow you to secure your deposits with other kinds of security and let the banks secure it with other kinds of security. And so we'd like to be able to make deposits in banks where the deposits are secured by other things. And that gives us more flexibility. We have a better chance of getting a better rate from banks and so forth.
Right. We have a phone call, do we?
I was going to question.
Oh, all right.
Okay,
I didn't
sure.
know we
Go right
had
ahead.
in studio.
Go right ahead.
question.
Yes, all right.
Yes, I was wondering if Columbia has any plans to put reflectors in the roads. I notice when it's rainy or snowing, it's very hard to see the lines in the roads, and it seems like a safety issue. I was wondering if that's been brought up or if it's being.
It has
looked
been
into.
brought up and discussed many times, and instinctively you think, let's do that. The problem seems to be in connection with snow plowing, and it's hard to put in reflectors that will survive the snow plows. And so that's been the issue. Of course, putting them in would be expensive, but there are times when you think, wow, I'd like to have them. We paint stripes, the painted lines are luminescent, but there's been a change by EPA with respect to the volatile materials that are used in the paints, and they have to be water-based. They don't hold up the way they used to, and so the painted stripes wear away faster than any of us would like. And so the need for some form of reflector is apparent, but that has been the problem.
It's a good question. I hear that concern a lot, especially from my wife.
Yeah, well, I hear it, and you know, you get on some of these streets on a dark, rainy night, you
Sure.
can't see it. It's hard to figure out where those stripes are.
Absolutely. Okay, the last proposition on the ballot that I'd like to talk about is Proposition 1. I believe you were one of perhaps the only council member who actually approved
That is right,
surveillance cameras, safety cameras downtown, whichever term you want to use. And you've told me that you support Proposition 1. I wonder if you'd like to talk about that.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about Proposition 1, and that is the cameras downtown proposition. I might point out that after the Taylor incident, where the young man was struck over the head by what appears to be sort of a gang type situation.
In a parking garage.
In a
right.
parking garage, and the whole thing was filmed on camera, and the cameras were very instrumental in apprehending the perpetrators of that. The mother, Karen Taylor, came down to the council and asked the council to reconsider. And I voted, and Jason Thornhill, I just
Okay.
want to tell you that,
Okay.
joined me in that, but the remainder of the council refused to even reconsider it. So Karen Taylor then went out, and we were talking about an initiative petition and counting the signatures and getting the change
Sure.
in the charter. Well, she went out and got the initiative petition signatures, turned it in, it went through the process, was approved, and that's why it's on the ballot today. Now, I'm for it, and I understand it's like so many other things. There are valid arguments to be considered for it and valid arguments to be considered against it. But in my view, the valid arguments for it outweigh the ones against it. And I see it this way, that downtown Columbia is one of our greatest assets. When you talk to visitors to Columbia and ask them what they like about Columbia, or even many of the residents at Columbia, what is it you like about Columbia? The downtown and its atmosphere and the historic buildings and the sidewalk restaurants and the crowds and the festivals and all these things rise right up toward the top. And so I think downtown is something that we need to invest heavily in to keep it as one of the major attractions for Columbia, attractions to life. And so there is concern by a significant number of people about whether or not it is truly safe to be on the streets of downtown Columbia. Now, the statistics, in my opinion, show that downtown Columbia is a relatively safe part of Columbia, quite a safe part of Columbia, I should say, and that there's very little risk on being the sidewalks of downtown Columbia. But there are a significant number of people, in my opinion, who don't come downtown because of that concern. And so I think that we need to assure them that, in effect, that, look, you are going to have the same kinds of surveillance in downtown Columbia as you would have if you're in the parking lot of one of downtown's competitors, the big box stores, the malls, and so forth. And so I just think it's an investment we should make in downtown Columbia. Now, do they prevent crime? That's one of the issues, of course.
Sure.
And I don't think anybody knows. So you got statistics of all kinds.
Studies on both sides.
And you can derive an argument from the statistics for either side.
Sure.
And so I don't think this is one where statistics are going to solve the issue for you. But they do certain things. They're there 24 hours a day. If you were to try and add an extra policeman to patrol for 24 hours a day, you really have to hire basically 4 police to get that done, considering time off and the 3 shifts that you need to be. Although they're now on 12-hour shifts, but so you might get by with 3 police. But policeman costs in the neighborhood $95,000 to $125,000.
Sure, by the time you pay them and equip
That's
them.
right, equip them, all these different things. So that's getting close to $500,000 every single year to provide that. So this is a very inexpensive way of having 24-hour surveillance. The other thing is that it can be helpful to the police. The camera will go on the internet. You have to have a password to get on, but you can take a look at it, and if somebody calls and says there's after hours issue going on over here, the police can bring it up on the internet, see what's there, figure out how many police to bring, what to do. So it's an aid to the police. And obviously, if somebody commits a crime on camera or runs in front of the camera escaping from a crime, it's an aid in
as we saw in the
crime.
Taylor case.
And we saw in the Taylor case. So those are the primary arguments for it. The arguments against it, I think, some people say, well, it's a poor investment of money, but I think when you compare it to the cost of police officers, it isn't a choice. It's a choice of $50,000, $25,000, which is being paid for by the special business district a year, versus almost $300,000 or $500,000 a year for another police officer, which would be better. Don't misunderstand me, but we don't have that, and it is an aid to the police. The opposition would say, well, what about privacy? That's a reasonable argument. But the response to that is, when you're on the streets of downtown Columbia, what is your true expectation of privacy? And the courts have all said, basically, there is no expectation of privacy, although some people may have an expectation of privacy. Right. So that's kind of it in a summary. And I support it. I supported it before. I continue to support it.
Okay. Now, we know that there are some pretty hot city council races on the ballot on
There
Tuesday.
are some,
And
yeah.
you have told me that you're not going to endorse any particular candidate.
No, I made the conclusion I'm not going to endorse. I think that I have had my run at it, 15 years, 5 terms, but I think that that's it. I don't want to act like I'm mayor after I'm through. And so one way to avoid that is just not get involved with the present races.
Do you have any thoughts about the way the campaign for mayor is unfolding at this point?
Well, it's been, it and some of the ward races have been pretty vigorous campaigns. And as happens so often when campaigns get heated up, people get pretty excited, and there's some negative campaigning going on. And I can sit here and pontificate and say I'm opposed to negative campaigning, but when you get in the middle of these things and people know what works and doesn't work, I think people are going to be able to judge the quality of the candidates with these campaigns.
Okay. Any concerns about the amount of money? I mean, you know,
Well,
since you ran in 1995, the level of spending on these campaigns has
It's
just
gone way, way up. And I think as Columbia gets to be bigger and bigger, that's going to be the case. And I think it's reflected in national politics as well. Now, there are people who are taking harder positions with respect to, I might say, the more extreme positions, and they're investing heavily in that. And so I think it's a reflection of the way things are. Things are split in Columbia, they're split out in the national scene, state scene as well. I would rather see less money spent. Another thing that is a factor, as your city gets bigger on a citywide race, if you're going to try and get your message out to everybody, it's pretty hard to do without starting to spend quite a bit of money.
especially in a mayor's race where you've got to go across
Well, you got
the
to
entire
go
city.
do the entire city. But so do the school board people.
Right.
And they have a harder time of it. They don't raise as much money.
Sure.
But it's not quite as high profile a job either. But that is a problem when you start having a city get larger and larger. One thing about Columbia, I'm sure you're well aware of this, that we are kind of a freestanding city, and our media is not diluted. You take some of these races where you run in a city that is surrounded by other cities, and the market where you have to buy the advertising is based on the size of the entire circulation,
Right.
then it really gets prohibitive. Here, you really do get a reasonable return for your investment. That's one good thing. Now, that may help, even though the numbers are high compared to what they they're not high compared to what they are in some cities.
Now, you mentioned, and I think it's true, at least as long as I've been covering government in Columbia, that there seems to be sort of a split. And I think the conventional wisdom, and perhaps it's exaggerated, but there's sort of this business and development interests versus environmental and smart growth interests. That seems to be, at least on the surface, the polarized.
Right, well, the people look at that as a polarization.
You seem to have remained above that fray, though, and I'm wondering how you've done that and what your thoughts are on that.
All right, well, I have several thoughts on that, and it's kind of interesting. First of all, I think that a lot of the people who hold themselves out as spokespersons for the so-called business community or the so-called smart growth community or environmental community don't truly represent the business community or the smart growth community. They represent a point of view that they have, and they're self-appointed representatives of these communities. And it's been my experience that the vast majority of the people who are in business and the vast majority of people who are interested in smart growth, say, or environmental issues, are quite understanding of the other person's point of view and share a lot of the same thing. A lot of the people who are interested in environmental are in business. And a lot of the people who are in business are interested in the environmental side of things and the planning. And I think that's where most of the people are. And so this split is highly advertised because the people who take these positions are so strident and so loud about it, and they get coverage on it, but I don't think that truly represents the actual situation that we have.
That's very similar to what we try to teach at the journalism school, whether we're successful or not. But we try to teach folks to get away from the extremes and focus on
Right,
the
and
vast
that's where it is.
majority of people
That's
who are
where it
somewhere
is.
in the middle.
And that's what makes Columbia really work well, is that we have I think, basically a progressive population that is really interested in making Columbia the best place to live it can be, and that the people are not anti-business, they're not anti-environment, they're for let's work out something where we can work together. And I think that the people coming in with the extreme point of view really hurt the progress of the community, to be quite honest with you.
There seems to be a theme out there that Columbia has become, or the city council has become, unfriendly to business. What would you say about that?
That's just not true. I think that that again is a point that is made by people who are holding themselves out as the representative business but don't truly represent business. And that's my humble opinion. And I think, now there are some, honestly, who have a pecuniary interest in being able to have relaxed a set of regulations and so on. They would say, well, these people are anti-business because they're putting regulations on me. But that's not anti-business. That may be that they feel that the developers need to meet various requirements, but that's not anti-business at all. And then they'll say, well, these environmentalists are anti-business, or the environmentalists will say that developers are entirely anti-environmental. Some are, but many are not. They're perfectly willing to follow the rules as long as you tell them. But there's a certain number who will be opposed to it, and a lot of the business people who will say, yeah, I agree, we need to take care of our streams, we need to take care of our air, we need to take care of these things. So the claim that the council is anti-business is just not justified. And in many ways, the decisions that the council makes are really very pro-business. Columbia's business depends on our having a successful community. And to have a successful community, it needs to be a beautiful community, it needs to have schools, it needs to have good infrastructure, it needs to have good parks, it needs to have trails, it needs to have a great downtown, it needs to have good planning, it needs to have all of these things. And when you do that, you end up with a city that is good for business. And we receive national kudos for being a business-friendly community, one of the best cities to live in and to do business in. And we have among the lowest unemployment rates in the whole state of Missouri. We have one of the most stable economies in the state of Missouri. And we've even been picked out as having one of the stable economies in the whole country. That's not a result of anti-business.
You sound like you're running for mayor. You know, one thing I have noticed, though, and I think there was a time when it was fairly deliberate, where the council did, during your 15 years as mayor, sort of make a shift toward planned zoning as opposed to open zoning. And I don't want to get too much into the particulars of land use, but I wonder if that's where some of the criticism has come from, where the council has been perceived as micromanaging developments, telling people how tall their light poles should be, where the trees should be planted.
Oh, I'm sure that is some of it, and we are trying to, but what you got to recognize is that the council tries to work its way into reasonable regulation. When you do that, you make some mistakes, you do some things right, do some things wrong, but you do need to regulate. The reason for development regulation is that the community as a whole is dissatisfied with some of the practices that take place without that regulation. And I think Columbia is much, much better off for the regulation that we have developed. Planned regulation, or planned development, which I very much favor, requires that there be plans submitted before you do what you're going to do. One of the important features of plan development is that when there is plan development, we are able to extract off-premises improvements. If you put in a plan development that is going to put a lot of traffic on a road, for example, we may be able to negotiate before the plan is approved to get a intersection built, or extra lanes built, or turn lane built, stoplight put in place. Various major impacts that development is going to have on the city's arterial and collector street system. And if you have what we call open zoning, where all you have to do is come in and show that you've met the stormwater regulations and you put the streets in or whatever it is, and we don't have any control over it, we don't have that right to extract those things. But in addition to that, with the plan development, we can require various landscaping, we can require various things that make a better community. Now, if you're a developer and you're a cowboy and say, you know, I just want to be able to do what I want to do, I don't care how ugly it is or whatever, you're not going to like that.
Right.
But I think as a community, you like it and should like it, and I'm pushing for it. Now, I think that our zoning and subdivision regulations are out of date. And it takes a while to learn how all that works. It's complicated. But I think that the future of Columbia is going to involve some very substantial changes in our planning and zoning regulations. And if I were to serve another term, I would like to be involved in that. And basically, I think we're going to try and look at what they call form-based regulation, where we try and say, okay, when it comes to this particular part of town, we'd like it to be a commercial center that would serve neighborhoods, for example. So we're going to just say you got to build the kinds of buildings that would serve that type purpose. And you have more control. But then the people could, instead of having a use, you could have a mixed development. And I think that in the long run is the way Columbia should go, and I think will go.
And I think you have a comprehensive growth management task force that's,
We do.
that's already working on this.
Yeah, well, the first step is a comprehensive master plan for the city of Columbia, which is, to a large extent, taking all of the plans that we already have and putting them together in a comprehensible form. And that's a really good idea.
Do you think the time has come for the council to start having more frequent meetings so that we don't have to be discussing some of these really important issues at 1 or 2 in the morning?
You know, we don't have very many meetings that go to that length.
Every once in a while.
Every once in a while. And so what we've tried to do lately is when we see something coming where we can predict that it's going to be a really long thing, then we'll have a special meeting just to deal with that. Smoking ban was one of them. We've had a couple others as well. I believe we did it with chicken ordinance, for example. And so that is one way of avoiding that. The only problem is sometimes we get taken by surprise.
Right.
And we don't know that it's going to result in a long meeting.
That happens to us at the newspaper.
That's right. And so then you have, well, what are you going to do? We feel, and I think really the charter basically says that everybody's going to have the right to come down and talk to a topic.
Right.
So we can't limit it by saying only so many people can speak. We do limit the time that they can speak. I oftentimes urge them to please not repeat what they've already heard and that kind of thing. And so it isn't too often that we have meetings that last, say, after midnight. And they start at 7. That's 5 hours. That's a lot, but think of the business that has to
It's
be
amazing.
done.
It's amazing.
It really is.
Now, you've been mayor 15 years. Did you have any idea when you first ran back in 1995 that you would be mayor 15 years later?
I had no idea. I can remember when I first was sworn in, I thought, oh my gosh, what have I done here? I wonder if I'm going to be able to last a full term with that. They'll probably drum me out of town. But, you know, at the end of the first term, I found myself running again, and then again, and again. The last time, I seriously considered not running.
You were having some health problems at the time, or had just recovered from
Well,
it.
I'd recovered. I was okay health-wise.
Right.
And so I thought, actually, I have this story. It's the truth. I decided I got to do something, so I called a press conference, and I still wasn't sure whether I was going to run or not. And Axie and I talked about it, and she says, well, it's up to you, but we kind of thought I wasn't going to run.
This was after you called the news conference.
And this is after I called. I got on my bicycle, rode down to the law office where I held the press conference, and opened my mouth, and I heard come out of it, I'm going to run.
Is that right?
That's about the way it went.
And what did Mrs. Hyman think of that?
Well, she was surprised, but I'll tell you, she's a trooper, and she got right down the way. We went right to work and did our campaign. And
So tell me, you know, the way you go about the job of mayor, it's got to be at least the equivalent of a full-time job.
Well, it is in many ways.
How much time do you invest in this?
Well, people ask that over and over again, and it depends on how you count your time. Obviously, you're at council meetings, you're on camera that period of time, and then there is the pre-council activity. Then we have work sessions. So just the official public meeting part of it is substantial.
Sure, and you've got to do your homework to be prepared for those
Then,
meetings.
you're right, it takes a long time to get ready for council meetings in reality, because there are a lot of complex issues.
Sure.
And then there's all the constituent service. And
Phone calls, email.
You get phone calls, tons of email. I get 100 emails or more every day, it seems like. And then there are out-of-town meetings. There are all kinds of things that I should appear at. And so if you count all of that, it truly is basically full-time.
Can you give us a peek inside the emails and the phone calls you get? What's the kind of stuff that really stirs people up that you hear the most about?
Well, it's usually something that the press has gotten interested in, and then it get people stirred up, and so they will form groups, send in the emails like mad. When it comes to being mayor, I get a relatively few emails that a ward representative could take care of. And when I get one, I will try and forward it on to the ward representative, the ward council person, and to the city staff. And then it gets worked out. One of the things that's very helpful is that the city clerk can see a lot of those emails and know that really it's only the staff that's going to be able to handle them.
Sure.
And will be able to send it to the right staff person. And so that cuts down on it. But when it comes to the policy issues where we're going to be voting on it, if something gets stirred up, you can get a lot of emails about people's opinions on that.
Do you ever lose patience?
No, I never lose patience. I sometimes can't keep up, but I will get overwhelmed by them, and but I don't ever lose patience.
Okay. What's the craziest phone call you ever got at home about
Well,
city
that's
business?
a good one. I don't know if I ought to be able to come up with a good one, but I'm
After
not sure.
15 years, it might be hard to...
There have been some dandies. Yeah.
Okay.
And they go everywhere from being very complimentary to really wanting to lynch me. You know, they go the extreme.
Well, speaking of patience, we talked a little bit before the show about the media saturation here in Columbia. I think it's been said, and it's probably true, that Columbia has more journalists, or at least wannabe journalists, per capita of any city in the country. And there probably are not very many days that go by when a Missourian reporter doesn't call you about this, that, or the other thing.
Yeah, I probably get at least a call a day and sometimes several from Missourian reporters.
I just wonder what your thoughts are about how the media saturation in Columbia influences the city in general, not necessarily just city government.
I think it's good for the city.
Do you?
I think it is. The media saturation, I think, makes people feel more involved with their city. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, today you can add all of the things like email and Twitter and the texting and all these
Sure.
different things that even give them the opportunity. And then the blogging is
Mm-hmm.
another factor. But I think that the idea that there is this much press coverage of Columbia works out to be good. Mm-hmm. And so people who with an interest in it can keep up pretty well with what's going on without too much effort on their
Mm-hmm.
part. There can be cities where there is lack of press,
Mm-hmm.
and the city government itself can be quite open. You can have pretty open records. People can get this stuff, but if they have to work to get it, they don't,
Mm-hmm.
and so they feel left out. Whereas here, I'll tell you, it is an open government, mm-hmm. and the press has something to do with that probably. And we recognize that whatever we do is going to be well covered. Mm-hmm. I oftentimes compare what kind of coverage the city council gets, the mayor gets, to what any other level of government gets. Mm-hmm. We get a lot more.
Yeah.
Just a lot more. And then it's read by the people we know, mm-hmm. right here, that we'll be seeing on the street that mm-hmm. very day or that very next day. Mm-hmm. So we have a highly scrutinized city government, and that's probably good.
Good.
And we like it. I like working with the Missourian reporters.
Well, I appreciate that.
All the newspaper reporters. And I get a big kick out of them because they come from everywhere, mm-hmm. and they're always bright, mm-hmm. and they're trying to do a good job. Mm-hmm. They're oftentimes close to overwhelmed by I mean, I would be too if I had to walk into some situation and try and report on it.
Sure, and yeah. you tell a young student to call the mayor, and they'll freak out sometimes.
Yeah, I'll
you
bet
want me to call the mayor?
Yeah, I'll bet that's right.
And I always assure them that the mayor is a very nice man.
Well, I always try and be friendly with them, right.
Uh-huh. Now, I think the first time I interviewed you was nearly 20 years ago when you were co-chair of the Columbia 2000 Commission.
Yes, that could be.
And I think a lot of people would say that that was a plan, a document that really was successful in laying out some goals and then watching the city follow through on them, the recreation center being probably the centerpiece of
right.
that. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, but even more, how you think this Imagine Columbia's future visioning process is playing out. What do you think?
Well, they were done somewhat differently. Mm-hmm. The Columbia 2000, and then later what they called the Columbia 2002, Roman numeral 2, meaning it
right.
was sort of the second one, mm-hmm. which was really an implementation of the Columbia 2000 mm-hmm. version. We tried to get public input when we did that, and we held meetings. We asked for people to let us know, and a fairly small group of us. I remember we would meet in small.
Mm-hmm. I think you had subcommittees and that sort of thing.
We had some subcommittees that worked on it, and we put this together, and it was well covered, and I think it really laid out a plan that future councils followed. This procedure for the present visioning committee mm-hmm. was much more open may not be the right word, but
Well, you had hundreds of people
But we
from
had
the
hundreds
public.
and hundreds of people get involved in it. Subcommittees, same idea, but you had all these different people on it. Now then, whether or not this represents a better sample of public thought than our smaller sample did, it's hard to know.
Right.
But there was a certain amount of buy-in by a lot of people who participated in it. I see criticism that, well, it's still made up of just a certain number of people. The rest of us didn't get to be involved, but they were invited. They were, I mean, it was truly an open thing. And I know as mayor, and I believe the council felt the same way, we stayed out of it. We didn't want it to look like it was a council document, but it was coming from the people. So I think it has a lot of potential. They're trying hard to make sure that it just doesn't fade away. There is a visioning implementation committee, and we, as you may know, when you pass a bill in the legislature and when we do it at the city, there's a fiscal note attached that says this is going to affect the budget in this way or it won't affect it at all. That's every bill that we have. But now we're going to have a visioning note attached. It says what we're doing here conforms with this part of the visioning or flies in the face of that part of the visioning. And so there's being special effort made to make sure that it remains in people's minds as we go forward. So it'll have an interesting impact on government decisions, and I think probably a good one.
Okay. Well, I'd like to talk to you before we run out of time a little bit about what you think your legacy is going to be here in Columbia. But before we do that, I think most of the viewers probably know that former Mayor Clyde Wilson died just a few days ago. I wonder if there's anything you'd like to say about Mr. Wilson.
Clyde Wilson was a great leader, actually. Clyde was a progressive, and at a time when they were rarer than they are today, I think, in many ways. And he was active in city government for many years. I think it was something like 20 years that he was involved. He served on the council, and he served as mayor. He was a person. Remember, I was talking about how there are people who hold themselves out as representing the business, hold themselves out as representing the environmentalists, and take rather extreme positions that don't really represent the way. Well, Clyde was, I think, a person, he was progressive, but he looked at it from a practical point of view. He worked with people who would have been more conservatively oriented, and the two of them could work together, and they were able to get very significant things done for Columbia. And so one of the lessons that he teaches is that, yes, you can work together, and you can bring opposite ideas down to work out a solution that will benefit everyone. And he is responsible for a good many things. One of them I remember is he is responsible for the rental property inspections.
Right.
And we had a pretty bad situation for rental properties for a long, long time. So a lot of tenants in our rental properties owe Clyde Wilson a lot, no doubt about it.
And he actually lived in a neighborhood that had a lot of rental properties in it.
Well, I
over
think
in
that's
East
right.
Campus.
That's right. And he's always interested in the preservation of East Campus,
Right.
which is good for Columbia because East Campus is a beautiful place, but as it butts the university and gets a lot of pressure from students.
Now, I think, you know, a lot of folks would, it's pretty easy to say, okay, Darwin Hyman, his legacy is going to be all about parks and trails, and there'll be that lasting image of you riding your bicycle around town. But I would suspect that there's even more to it than that. What would you like people to recall most about your time?
Well,
as
I'm
mayor?
proud, by the way, of the parks and the trails. And trying to get activity into people's lives, and beginning to get people to think in terms of health, because I really think this is what it's all about. I have a philosophy about government, and that is that the purpose of government is to help as many people as possible have a satisfactory life. And that's a complex thing. And when you stop and think about it, the government itself isn't going to make anybody rich. And so we're not going to help them have satisfactory lives by making them wealthy. But what we're going to do, I think a government can do, is to provide the basics that it takes to have that satisfactory life. And that involves lots and lots of things. It involves housing, it involves decent infrastructure, it involves trying to have an economy that will support reasonable living standards for the people, housing, it involves health, it involves recreation, it involves art, culture. All of these things, and I haven't named them all, but without checklist, I probably can't, that it involves all these things. And so the goal that I had as mayor was to make sure that everything that you really ought to provide to enable people to have a satisfactory life got attention. And so many of the things do get automatic attention. We all know that we got to keep our streets safe, up to standard. We got to have fire protection, police protection. There's constant demand for that. There's constant demand for economic development and all of these things. But there isn't so much demand for, let's make sure that the arts are taken care of, or the trails and so on are taken care of. So that's why I spent, and probably got a reputation for being so involved in those, is I felt like those were likely to be neglected.
Right.
Even though I think they are right there with those other elements that you have to have that satisfactory life. But I worked on all of the others, but you don't get as, you're not as conspicuous because there are all kinds of other people out there working on them too. Sure. And as mayor, you're not normally personally accomplishing all this, you're helping others accomplish it. So when it comes to a legacy, I am sure that the thing people most likely remember would be the art, the trails, the parks, but it's partly policy. Like in parks, have this goal to have a park within a half mile of everybody's home. And that's a great thing. But these other things, like the streets that you build, we've got great streets in Columbia. Trying to keep the city beautiful. Our economy, I've already mentioned how we probably have one of the best economies in the state. Those are really important as well, but you probably don't make up your legacy so much.
Right. So you've got one more regular council meeting coming up on Monday.
One more regular council meeting. That's
and then the meeting where you'll swear in your successor.
That is right. Well, actually, the city clerk does the swearing in.
All right.
But
that's April 12th.
And that's April 12th. And I think it's going to be at 6 o'clock, and there'll be a little reception for the new council members, and maybe a little. I'll probably eat a little bit too.
So, how are your emotions as this approaches?
Well, they're mixed. I know of a lot of things that I'd like to be around as are finished that have been started. There are other issues like the planning and zoning activities. I think planning is really taking off, and I think the reform of the zoning regulations is great. I'd like to be involved in a lot of those things. One issue that I'm really interested in is the stormwater issue, the land disturbance issue. Want to see more done with the trees. I think that Columbia has changed its approach to economic development, and it is now on exactly the right track where we're trying to take advantage of the knowledge-based society here. So I think we're going to have some really exciting times with economic development. So I'm going to miss all that. But on the other hand, I'm going to like Monday nights at home. That's
I'll
right.
bet. And you plan to do some canoeing and of
I'm
course some
going to do some
bicycling?
canoeing. Maybe we can go canoeing together.
Right.
Yeah. And,
That would be great.
hiking and
And we have just, hiking, canoeing, I'd love to do all that stuff with you. We have about 2 minutes left.
Okay.
I wonder, any secrets you want to share for your successor about things about the job of being mayor that people just don't realize until they take the office?
I think that people just don't really understand what a broad-based job it is and how many things you have to deal with. One of the things I think people often think of is I'll come in here and I will push this particular idea. You hardly have time to get around to it because of all the other things that come your way, both expected and unexpected, that just consume you. So you just need to be ready to be flexible. And but I, again, am not going to try and be a mayor after I'm no longer mayor.
Okay. Well, I think I speak for the entire city, Darwin, when I say you've been a fantastic mayor. It's been 15 years of really profound service on your part, and I want to thank you on behalf of all the journalists in town. And I'm sure that there are lots of people who are going to be thanking you in the days to come. So.
Well,
Thank
thank
you,
you, Scott.
And it's been my pleasure to be here. I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate your coming down to do this. So.
Okay, great. Can we cut it there?
Are we through? Okay.
All right. Didn't know how to nail it right down.
Well, you did very well.